Good morning and welcome to our webinar, Considerations for Land Spreading Milk. This webinar is sponsored by the University of Wisconsin College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the Nutrient and Pest Management Program, and the UW Division of Extension. I'm Jamie Patton with the Nutrient and Pest Management Program, and I'll be your moderator today. When you received your email about today's webinar, included was a link where you can submit questions. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentations. Please note that Dr. Stevenson, our first presenter, will answer questions immediately after his talk, as he is expected at another workshop. However, we'll wait to answer questions for the other three presenters at the end of the webinar. It's unlikely that we'll be able to answer all of your questions live, as our webinar is slated to end at 12 o'clock. However, we will be aggregating questions and developing written responses. We will post the responses as well as the link to today's recorded webinar on the Extension Ag Institute and Dairy Team websites in the coming days. With that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Mark Stevenson is an Extension Dairy Policy Specialist and Director of the UW Center for Dairy Profitability. He will be speaking on where we are and why we are here, a look at the dairy markets. Dr. Stevenson?
Thank you, Jamie. And if we could have the next slide, I think I'll just move right into it. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the COVID crisis that we're in right now, and to see where we are in this. I want to disabuse people that this is going to be over quickly if we think that's the case. I know even this morning on the news, we heard a little bit about the curve is flattening, and I do think that that's the case, or at least we're starting to see the rate of new cases slow, but we're certainly not at the peak yet. Worldwide, there have been more than 1 million cases and about 74,000 deaths as of last night. United States, about 3,600 cases and about 10,000 deaths. And in Wisconsin, about 2,400 cases and 77 deaths. I actually think it was more like 82 deaths or something that I had seen this morning. So this is truly a serious pandemic, and it is moving rapidly across the country. If we could have the next slide. This is a chart that's just showing you the rates of new cases. And you can see by this that it's differed from country to country. A few countries like South Korea that we see in that turquoise color near the bottom there has flattened rather quickly. They got on top of their cases in a hurry, and they have managed to slow the new infection rates down by a significant amount. The US, on the other hand, has been slow to react, to get into much of the restrictions on social distancing that we're now having in effect. But you can see that we are slowing down. We're beginning to have those case numbers bend, although they tell us that it's likely to be the case that this will continue for many more weeks, and we are going to be feeling the impact of that on dairy markets. If I could have the next slide, please. We've already had a tremendous crush on our dairy markets out here. And locally in Wisconsin, of course, we are always thinking about cheese. Just for your information, about half of the cheese is consumed in out-of-home eating and about half in-home eating. Out-of-home eating is both restaurants and takeout sales, but it's also institutional. That's things like food and elderly care facilities and that type of thing. So we do have quite a bit of consumed cheese out of the home. And the vast majority of the American processed cheese, in case you don't know what that is, those are those little individually wrapped cheese slices that we have put on burgers at fast foods and sometimes serve at home with grilled cheese. And also that semi-plastic cheese that gets pumped on a plate of nachos in restaurants. But the vast majority of that is served through fast food service. And those sales fell off almost immediately when we did our social distancing and restaurants closed. But pizza sales are almost all takeout anyway. There's some served in restaurants, but more than 75% of pizza sales are takeout. And by several accounts, those sales have surged. So people are continuing to purchase pizza, and we're selling more cheese that way. But the total cheese consumption, while it's up at retail as consumers are shopping there and taking it home, it's been down at food service and institutional establishment. The net negative on cheese sales is conservatively 5% and probably closer to 10%. So we've had a net loss in sales. Next slide, please. We are making that American style processed cheese out of barrel cheese, and we have a number of barrel cheese plants in our region. Not many here in Wisconsin, just a couple of them, but 5 of them throughout the Minnesota-Wisconsin area. And collectively, they account for about 12% of milk production in the 2 states. So when those plants are essentially shut down, that's quite a bit of volume that has to be moved off through other plants, but we've got the capacity to be able to handle that. However, as I mentioned, our total cheese demand, not just the barrel cheese, is depressed, and cheese plants don't want any more product right now than they are making. So if I could have next slide, please. Those markets have moved milk to meet that consumer demand. About 2/3 of fluid milk is consumed in the home. That's been true, for quite some period of time, and those fluid sales are up. We've even had reports of empty shelves in retail stores and limits on purchases. And that reverses a long-standing trend that we've been seeing toward less consumption of beverage milk. But food service and institutional sales still account for the other third of that fluid and beverage milk product, and those sales are way down. So the total fluid consumption is a net negative. Again, maybe a negative 5 to 10%. Next slide. The butter is another situation where we have quite a loss of consumption here. More than half the butter is used in out-of-home eating, meaning restaurants and institutional services. And those butter uses are substantial there. Butter sales are up at retail, but not nearly by enough to offset the loss in out-of-home use. Total butter consumption a net negative by maybe 10 to 20%. So if you take a look at all of these products, we are clearly down in demand for dairy products, and that's a real problem. Next slide. But I have to also mention that just at the time all of this social distancing was breaking and our demand started to have some real problems and issues, we were beginning to build up a head of steam for milk production in the country. In fact, our flush this spring looks like it was going to be a fairly big one. Milk production with the last February report that we had was up 1.7% across the country, and cow numbers were up as well. The states, particularly Western states, were bracing for a fair amount of milk production. If you look at Wisconsin, our milk production was actually down about 0.8% in the last report, and that's largely due to feed availability and quality issues. Next slide. So this large milk production that we're having in the country would be keeping a lid on milk prices anyway. And the other thing that's been a bit of an issue for us is that coming into this, we have more than adequate inventories of storable dairy products. Cheese hasn't been excessively burdensome, but it's been plentiful. And so none of our buyers upstream are in a rush to secure their stores of dairy products for later in the year, knowing that there was plenty there. And as we're seeing all of this problem and issue now happening, many of those buyers are buying cheese only as needed. They're kind of sitting on the sidelines and watching prices fall. We've had export disruptions as well. There have been a number of countries where orders are well down. Sales to Mexico. Mexico's our largest buyer of dairy products, and Canada, as far as that goes, is the third largest buyer. They have had a lack of sales going to those countries, particularly Mexico has dropped off a great deal. And this is in part their reaction to their own COVID issues down there. It's not that those borders are closed to the trucks moving there, but the demand simply hasn't been there. We've also had problems overseas trying to move product on barges and containers like we do. And the service at ports has been shut down. It was a big problem with China initially. Their strict social distancing closed ports, and those ships sat at harbor for a few weeks before they got unloaded. And more recently, we've had harbors like the Los Angeles port being closed, so we aren't loading ships as readily and moving product out. The final thing that I think is a big concern here is that all of this going on, not just in the dairy industry, but all kinds of supply chains for all kinds of industries are hugely disrupted. We've heard some stories about Apple having trouble making iPhones and coming back a little bit now, but that's because those supply chains are disrupted. And there's a great concern that the world is just in a tailspin toward worldwide recession. If that happens, that has its own set of problems as far as dairy demand goes. We only have to think back to 2008 and 9 when we were in a widespread recession, not just in the US, but other countries, and export sales fell and milk prices dropped precipitously. Next slide. I just wanted to show you that here's an example of futures markets price opinions for the contract month of May upcoming here. In the middle of January, we had prices at the $17.50 to $18 range. That's what people were expecting those May prices would be. But that was exactly when COVID was announced. And at first, we didn't have identified cases in the US. However, cases in China were a great concern, and they were disrupting the export sales. And so we began to see prices erode. And as you can see, as of last Friday's reports on futures markets, the markets had dropped somewhere between $5 and $6 per contract for Class 3 and Class 4. Those are huge drops and declines, and I expect that many of those are going to be fulfilled even by the time we get there because, price opinions have declined just that much. Next slide. We've got a number of other concerns in the dairy industry. It's bad enough for any individual farm operator or laborers on the farm who may contract the virus. That could disrupt the milking and the feeding and all the rest of the things that happen on any one dairy farm. But it could be worse if things like that begin to happen downstream from the farm. Just as an example, many of the milk haulers in our state here are pretty small operations. They may own and operate 1 or 2 trucks. And if those drivers get sick and need to quarantine, then getting milk off your farm could be a problem. So not just for any one farm, but the half dozen farms or more that are being picked up by those routes could be disrupted. And having trained and certified drivers for milk trucks to be replacements is not really a very deep bench for us. So I think it would be hard to replace many of those folks in the short run. And we've also seen in the Northeast that dairy plants that get a positive coronavirus ID can impact the entire plant. There's been one plant out there that's been closed down for a 2-week period of time as they're quarantined, but I don't think that's likely to be the case in most of our plants. Dairy plants are just hyper clean and, foot baths and hand washing that happens as they go from room to room anyway. And under this kind of circumstance, it may be that we have a few workers that would need to quarantine, but probably not close the entire plant. But if they're a key person in the plant, or if, just take, for example, lab and testing, those persons are highly skilled, it might be very difficult to replace them and have the plant operate as normal. Next slide. We've had a number of cooperatives and even dairy plants that have, who are buying milk directly from producers, that have sent out letters to their patrons. They're asking for things like voluntary reductions in milk production. And I think if you look at the totality here of the collapsed demand and the relatively big milk supply that we've had across the country, we need to reduce the milk supply. That's the only way of getting out of this. We can't just produce the product and stick it in cold storage for a period of time. It's too much. Those co-ops have also reminded many of their members that they do have supply management protocols in place, which could be invoked. And some of them probably will have been invoked at this point in time. But milk is already being dumped across the state. The last that I heard, and this is not anything that I have hard numbers on, was about 100 producers that have dumped milk already. And that's not even the totality of what we've seen. There's also milk that's not dumped, but it's sold at a term that's a legal term in the federal milk marketing order, and that's distressed prices. That means that you're selling milk below minimum milk price levels because people didn't want it. But if the price was absolutely really right, they might take an extra load or two. So we do have distressed milk that's being sold. Next slide. All of this together just, I think, means it could be a brutal year. This was looking by the end of 2019 that 2020 would be a price recovery year. The fourth quarter in 2019 was good, and the first couple of months of 2020 were also good. But as you can see by that chart that we showed earlier of May prices, those price opinions have just really collapsed. And this looks like we may be going into the sixth year of low prices in a row. And this has the potential to be probably the lowest price year that we've had in this last 5 years. So there are some things that I think producers should be encouraged to do, and that is try to understand what your cash shortfall is going to be and meet with your bankers and establish good communications about whether you need additional access to credit or possibly to restructure loans if you're that kind of credit worthy. I also think that we do have some farms that are so stretched that they're not likely to get much more credit. That's not a large proportion of our farms, but there are certainly some of them. And it will be time to ask hard questions about whether we should simply be looking at exiting the industry. And I think that these price declines this year are likely to be deep enough that we get into a level where we're not even covering the operating costs, such as the feed or labor cost to milk the cows, let alone pay all your costs, your fixed cost as well. If we get into that kind of situation, and we did back in 2009, then we saw farms that asked every animal in their herd whether they were covering their operating cost, and they culled so that we had barns operating below capacity. That seldom happens, but it did then. Perhaps we should consider some feeding strategies, just not to push production as hard and reduce feed prices as well, or dry cows off early if they aren't contributing much to the profitability of farm. Next slide. If we look at the dairy margin coverage program, at the time producers were signing up in December, we didn't have forecasts of any months that would be paying even at the $9.50 level. Everything was about $10 or above for a margin. And you can see by this chart right here, which was again last Friday's chart, that now our price opinions have changed rather dramatically, and we expect those margins to fall to levels even below $6 in the May and June time period. Over the total course of the year, the payouts at the $9.50 level for those producers who have bought up that far could be as much as $1.85 on all milk production for the year. The good news is the corn prices have also declined if you're purchasing corn, but not by enough to offset these milk prices. Next slide. We have the possibility of some federal help. The CARES Act was passed and signed into law, $2.2 trillion, and some of that money was identified for agriculture, $14 billion for CCC replenishment. Much of that, and the word replenishment refers to the fact that we deficit spent CCC to make the market facilitation payments last year. So really that's money that's replenishing what was already spent, not necessarily new money for producers. But there is $9.5 billion that the US Secretary can use to help agriculture out, including dairy. And there's another $15.8 billion for the food and nutrition programs. So that can be very helpful, not only for those people who are food insecure, but also to keep the lines of food moving toward folks that need it. We also have the SBA loans, $350 billion administered from the Small Business Association and through Farm Credit. It is available to farmers, so if you maintain your employees, there is the possibility of zero interest and forgiveness of loans through that particular program. You'll have to look at those details as they're more being trotted out all the time. But agriculture has been identified as a critical sector, and such things as transportation means that drivers won't time out. They can drive for a longer period of time than they otherwise would have, just to make sure that we're moving food from farms to plants and from plants to distribution and resale. National Milk and IDFA, the Dairy Processors Association, has asked for a number of things. And just last night, my slides don't contain it, some of the details of what their ask was have been made available. So ignore what the bottom line is there, and I'll tell you just a couple of those things very quickly. One of them is a $3 per hundredweight payment to dairy producers on 90% of their milk production. But that would be only if you reduce your milk production by 10% from the March levels that were recorded. So reduce your milk supply by 10% and you could receive $3 per hundredweight on milk from April through September. That would be suspended in any particular month if class 3 or 4 price average was above $16. Remember, this is not in place yet, but this is what's been asked for, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see some or much of this enacted by USDA. Also, temporary milk disposal reimbursement. So if milk has to be dumped, then producers would be paid at least the lowest class price, probably class 4. And that would be a program that would run from April through June for the dumped milk period of time. Next slide, Carrie. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you don't have these slides, so I'll just walk through it a little bit. Federal help, recourse loan for processors so that they can have additional access to working capital to keep employees in place. It would be available for virtually all dairy products, and they would only cover the value of the milk that was used in the products, not processing costs and other things. Forgivable loans for processors, similar to the SBA loans, but if they kept on staffing, then they would be allowed to access those loans as well. Finally, dairy product purchases for food banks and modifying federal feeding programs. And they would also ask to reopen the dairy margin coverage program, but allow producers to retroactively sign up for 2020. However, the catch on this is that it would be a mandatory election for the rest of the farm bill and with no discount. So if you wanted to sign up for the 950 level, for example, you would be signing up for the next 4 or 3 years after this as well. So those are the programs that would be in place. And if we had time for a question or two, I would be happy to take that.
Thank you, Mark. And we do have a couple questions. One of them, will import and export close formally as well as demand dropping?
It's not going to formally close. We still are continuing to export. But you know, we had better numbers that showed up with our February export data. That's the last that we had. But there's no question that exports, when you talk with people who are exporters, are telling me that it's dropped dramatically, more than half, to major customers in Mexico and Canada, for instance. So I think that, you know, by the time we get March and April numbers, we will see that exports have fallen pretty precipitously too. And that's why I think people are beginning to talk about we may have as much as 10% surplus milk on the marketplace. It's not just a collapse of domestic demand, it's also the export demand.
Thank you, Mark. How do processors have a plan for potential environmental impacts of milk dumped by their producers?
Processors don't have a plan for producers. But you know, any milk that they have to deal with directly, I mean, if it's going into a city water system, for example, or sewer system, you know, those processors will have to work with the city to make sure that they can handle the biological oxygen demand of the product being dumped there. I think that our producers are going to find a good bit more about what has to happen to milk that would be land applied or otherwise kept in the lagoon for a period of time the rest of this program today.
Thank you, Mark. And one last question. Why don't we ramp up distribution and give milk and cheese, et cetera, to food pantries versus dumping it?
It is being ramped up rapidly, and that was one of the pieces of the joint effort by National Milk and International Dairy Foods Association, where they're saying to, as rapidly as possible, open up those channels and let's get dairy product purchases for food banks moving quickly. And you know, we do have, even on food and nutrition programs, SNAP programs, a limit of about $450 per family of 4 per month, which is perhaps not adequate, especially in these days and times. So they've asked that that be increased as well to be able to get more food to people.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for joining us today. As we move on, our next speaker is Dr. Carrie Lebowski, Extension Soil Fertility Specialist and Professor in the UW-Madison Department of Soil Science. The title of Dr. Lebowski's presentation is Nutrient Availability, Agronomics, and Water Quality Issues Associated with Land Spreading Milk. Carrie?
Thank you, Jamie, and good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to jump right into this. There are some substantial issues with milk being dumped on or land spread. And so we'll just start with the water quality concerns. We know that milk, if we make a comparison to a liquid dairy manure with less than 4% dry matter, milk has 6 times more available nitrogen, 9 times more available phosphate. And so you're all aware of the water quality issues that we have when nitrate leaches into groundwater, human health concerns, when phosphate especially moves off the soil surface into rivers or lakes. We have a lot of eutrophication, algal growth. There could be fish kills, cyanotoxins produced. So there's a lot of negative consequences of too many nutrients moving into water. And the other thing that happens with dairy or milk compared to dairy manure is it has 5 times more biochemical oxygen demand than what manure does. And so what is this biochemical oxygen demand? Well, it is the amount of oxygen that's required by microbes to break down organic materials. And so what this means is when milk or manure were to get in water, the bacteria would start breaking that milk or manure down, and it uses up the oxygen in the water. And when you get very low oxygen, dissolved oxygen concentrations in water, it can result in fish kills, and it can destroy aquatic habitat. And to give you a sense of how potent milk could be, Jamie very nicely did a little calculation for me and said that if we had 1,600 gallons of water and we added 1 pint of milk, the bacteria would consume all of the oxygen in that water, just trying to break down that 1 pint of milk. And so that's pretty impressive in a negative sort of way about how adding a high BOD material to water can impact aquatic life. And so with these issues related to water quality, our primary concern when land spreading milk is that we do not want it to run off the surface and get into surface water. And we also do not want it leaching into groundwater. And so with that, we'll talk a little bit more about how do we start using milk as a nutrient source. And so if we look here at this table, we've pulled this together from a few different sources. We have the nutrients here, and then we have nutrients in milk, and then in a very liquid dairy manure. And you can see how much higher the nitrogen, phosphorus, and to some extent potassium is in milk compared to the available nutrients in dairy manure. And calcium is very similar levels. Milk has less magnesium than what dairy manure has, a little bit more available sulfur perhaps than manure. If we look at boron, both have very little amounts of boron. There's almost next to no manganese in milk. It's detectable, but it's extremely small. And zinc itself is also very low in milk. I only put these down just so that you could see when you're looking at that, that's well under like 1/8 of a pound per 1,000 gallons. So not very much at all. And if we think about these nutrients that are available here in milk, or that are in milk, we should consider 100% of the nutrients plant available. So with dairy manure, not all the nutrients are plant available. And I should have had this listed in the heading here that this is available manure nutrients for the comparison. And if we think about this 46, 26, 17 for NPK of milk, that has a fertilizer value of $32.60 per 1,000 gallons. So one thing that you, I think, should be doing as you're thinking about land spreading milk is try to make some lemonade out of these lemons. And that would be to really try to capture this value, the fertilizer value of milk, and because you can reduce your fertilizer bill. And so try to look at it from that standpoint. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the nitrogen. Nitrogen in milk is primarily in readily degradable proteins. That's why we expect that about 100% of it would be plant available, although we have not come across any studies where people have done field trials on this. And we do know that there's milk urea nitrogen is a really pretty small amount of the total nitrogen in milk. It's less than 1 pound per 1,000 gallons, and it might be like less than half a pound per 1,000 gallons. And we also know too, as you know from your milk testing, that the protein concentration of milk varies. And so if you wanted to get a better sense of what the nitrogen value of your milk is, you could take your percent protein from your milk test, multiply that by 13.48, and you'll get your pounds of N per 1,000 gallons. So that's one way to do that. Now the phosphorus numbers, I should point out the PK and everything other than nitrogen and sulfur, those numbers came from a research study in Alberta, Canada, that was published last year, where they looked at the mineral content of milk. So those are fairly recent numbers for good producing herds. And so that's where those numbers come from. We also assume that phosphorus and potassium will be 100% available. And like manure, milk will oversupply phosphorus to the crop if it's applied to meet crop nitrogen needs. So just keep that in mind. And so when you're considering where you want to apply the milk, think about your soil test phosphorus levels when you select an application rate. If your soil test P is less than 50 parts per million, you can apply to meet crop nitrogen need or legume removal. 50 to 100 part per million soil test do not exceed crop phosphorus removal. And if you're over 100 part per million soil test, don't exceed 75% of crop removal. Alternatively, using your nutrient management plan and looking at your phosphorus index and SNAP Plus can help you also select a good site for milk application. Now, some of you may be wondering about testing, because I encourage folks to test their manure. And most milk labs may not be set up to do mineral nutrients in manure. So that might not be something that you can actually do. Some places, they may have other laboratory activities going on. They do other tests, that they have the equipment and may be willing to do that. So we might just need to be primarily relying on book values for P and K. Maybe you can adjust your nitrogen values based on your normal milk test. So that would be one thing. If you do end up putting milk into a manure pit, I would suggest testing that the material as it's being applied to fields to get a sense of, what is the nutrient composition of this milk manure mixture that you have. Now, here's some application guidance. Key things: milk should not enter ground or surface water. You need to follow all nutrient management planning setbacks. You should also be applying only to soils that are suitably dry. last fall was pretty wet and there was a lot of damage done to some fields trying to get corn silage out, maybe manure application, etc. So you want to look for soils that you can get on. And one good way to think about this is if you can take some soil and form a ball and squeeze the ball, and if no moisture appears, then you're probably suitably dry to be applying milk to that field. Now, you also want to avoid applications when rainfall is predicted, is imminent, or directly after a rain. And so one good place to look for is the Runoff Risk Advisory Forecast System at this website. That'll kind of help guide you whether those soils are suitably dry, and maybe you could try to get out there and apply milk. And like runoff, milk should not be ponding during application. So if it's you apply the milk and it's laying ponded on the soil surface, that's not a good thing because it's too much, and obviously the milk isn't soaking into the ground very well. Some other things to think about: all the nutrients that have been or will be applied must be credited towards the total nutrient application rate for that field. And so what that means is you have, say you're targeting 160 pounds of nitrogen for that cornfield, you need to subtract off any nitrogen that may have already been applied in manure. If it was from a while ago, you may need to subtract off any fertilizer applied. Maybe you had MAP or DAP applied last fall. Those nutrients need to be subtracted off. And then once you have that amount remaining, that would be kind of your limit of what you could do with a milk application. You also want to be applying milk uniformly across fields. A shallow injection or incorporation would be good, help reduce the odor and the risk to runoff. Ideally, you probably don't want to be putting milk on tile drain fields, but if there are no alternatives, till the soil 3 to 5 inches deep and then put the milk down. That's to break up any surface like wormholes or anything that could cause the milk if you just surface applied on the tile to be a direct conduit down to the tile line. And if your tile lines are running, you probably should not be applying milk on that field. You want to make sure your equipment's calibrated properly, and you want to be using liquid manure application equipment for this. And consider multiple applications and using less volume per application. There's a lot of fats in milk, and they might plug some of the soil pores, and that could lead to ponding. So you may need lower application rates. And some research in New Zealand suggests that you maybe need to wait 20 days between applications to allow enough time for microbes to grade the milk. Now, when we look at selecting fields, I'm going to have a couple slides here, and we're talking about areas that you should be avoiding. And the reason you're avoiding these areas are these are situations where they could lead to runoff or lead to leaching. And so that's what the avoidance part of this is. So you want to avoid steep slopes or long slope lengths, high soil test phosphorus levels, or if you have a high P index. If you have fields where you have your estimated erosion rate is greater than tolerable soil loss, we want to avoid applying to those fields. So all of that, ties into typically a lot of steeper slopes if you have highly erodible fields. Now, you also want to avoid applying next to streams, rivers, lakes, wetlands, ditches. I don't have on the slide wells, but clearly you don't want to apply next to wells. And this photo here is showing some of the restrictions. So this comes from SNAP Plus, Nutrient Management Planning Software. Some of the restriction maps. We have on the right here, this is a 300-foot buffer for a stream. And then on the left, we have a 1,000-foot buffer for a lake. I know they look the same size, but picture was cropped. So you're only seeing a tiny little edge of the lake here. And so if we look at this field 4 that's outlined in the diagram, you can see that we have about half of the field or more would be acceptable to apply milk to because there aren't any restrictions. But when we get down in here, we probably don't want to apply milk because we're getting too close to water. And I also want to point out there's a private well right here. That's the red indication. So we want to stay back from that. Some other areas we want to avoid are seasonal or permanent high water tables and sites that have a potential high or moderate potential for flooding. Now, some other places are if you have sandy soils or loamy sand soils, especially if the subsoil is sandy, they may not be the best candidates for milk application, as well as soils that are shallow to bedrock. If you have conditions, if you're applying, and this is primarily happens more in season, where you have cracks, the soil surfaces become dry and you have large cracks at the surface, that could create conduits to go deeper into the soil, and you're kind of bypassing the soil and getting closer to groundwater. If you have fields that have had manure or fertilizer applied last summer, they're probably not good candidates for milk application. And if you have alfalfa or another forage legume stand that was terminated last fall, or you plan to terminate this spring, you do not want milk on there. You have very large nitrogen credits coming from those forage legumes that there's not going to be any capacity for that soil to handle the nitrogen in milk. And as I said before, you want to avoid tile drain fields. Now, keep in mind, this milk, as it gets on the field, it might stink. And so you might want to give any nearby neighbors who could be impacted by the odor, give them a phone call, let them know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and just to give them a heads up and be polite. I think they'll probably appreciate that. And then again, SNAP Plus nutrient management planning software is and your nutrient management plan in general are really good tools to help you figure out the best place to put milk. Now we're going to move into some considerations, the agronomic aspect of this, because we don't just want to put the milk out there. We want to keep it in place. Have the environmental issues, but we need to consider our crops too, because we do need to grow them and have feed for our cattle. And so when we think about corn for grain or silage, sorghum, sudan grass, or other warm season grasses, consider side dressing milk to reduce the potential for early season nitrogen losses and increased crop utilization on somewhat poorly drained and wetter soils and sandy soils that are somewhat excessively drained. Now, pre-plant applications may be done fairly easily on moderately well and well-drained soils. We don't tend to have as many issues with denitrification losses on these type of soils. And the lower soil temperatures at pre-plant may help limit some of the odor. And a pre-plant application may not be ideal on somewhat poorly drained and wetter soils, just because we often see denitrification losses of fertilizer or manure applied pre-plant on those type of those wet fields, and the milk would be the same thing. We would end up denitrifying it and losing that nitrogen, maybe leaching some of it, and then we'd still end up having to come back with perhaps with some commercial nitrogen to account for that loss. Also kind of discourage pre-plant applications on our sandy, excessively drained soils. Now, probably want to avoid applying over the top of plants for corn and such. Any milk that sits on the foliage for any period of time will dry up, and then as it rains, may then move off and run off the field. And if you're in a multi-cut forage system, you could apply manure, very shortly after the cutting. It will help minimize some of the crop damage. And after your warm season grasses are harvested, you might consider a milk application if you can get a cover crop established. If it's too late that you can't get a cover crop established, then maybe you don't want to apply milk out there. Now, if we're thinking about small grains for any use, whether it's for grain, as a cover crop, for forage, pre-plant applications will provide opportunities for incorporation. And keep in mind that milk applications should not exceed crop nitrogen need here for these small grains. It does provide the potential for increased lodging, and also if you have more vegetative growth, you might have greater incidence of disease. And again, you want to limit applications over the top of the growing crop. And after you harvest your small grains, you have an opportunity for a milk application, but you do want to follow that with a cover crop. So say after you take wheat off in July, maybe you can get in there with some milk there, and then but you do need a cover crop to capture that nitrogen. Now, if we think about legumes, and this might be a good place for some of the milk to go, because you probably haven't applied manure to some of these fields. And legumes, while they fix their own nitrogen and we don't normally need to put nitrogen on, they will use soil nitrogen preferentially over fixing in. And so there have been studies done that whether manure was applied or not applied to alfalfa, that at the after harvests, there was no difference in soil nitrate levels with and without the manure application. So demonstrating that the preferential use of soil applied nitrogen. And so if you've got alfalfa or clovers, apply shortly after cutting to minimize the crown damage. You don't want much regrowth before you go out there and make that application. And for soybeans, milk might produce some very lush vegetation, and that could increase your risk of infection by the white mold pathogen. So be careful with that. In the table here on the right, we have some between alfalfa and red clover and soybean, we have several different yield ranges that you might expect. The maximum N application that you could apply for this, there's no nitrogen recommendation, but in this situation, here's the maximum you could apply. And then the right column shows the maximum milk application. So if we think about an alfalfa field, if you're over 3.5 tons per acre, the most you're going to be able to apply milk would be about 4,500 gallons. And soybeans, if you're over about 45 bushels per acre, your limit of milk would be about 4,200 gallons. Just to give you a sense that these are kind of relatively low rates that would be applying for milk, especially compared to some of the rates that we might think of for manure application. Now, moving on to pastures here, apply shortly after grazing or harvest. And you want to maximize the number of days between when you apply milk to your pasture and when it's going to be grazed or harvested. We don't know how milk, when it's sitting on the forage, will alter the palatability, ensiling, or general quality of the forage. So be careful with that and allow enough time. If you apply it after it's been grazed or if it's cut as a hay, there's less foliage to intercept the milk, so more of it should soak in. And if you have enough time between the application and when it's harvested or grazed, hopefully there'll be less issue on the palatability and other potential problems. If you have pure grass stands, like our nitrogen fertilizer recommendations, split the application into 2 or 3 applications during the season, with the final application about mid-August. The table here on the left side for grass hay, then this would be what would be considered probably pure grass. You do not intentionally have legumes seeded in it. Our maximum N recommendation is 130 pounds, and that's all you should be putting on for milk, about 2,800 gallons. If we get into legume grass mixtures, here's the maximum N application rates and then the associated maximum milk application rates that could occur. Now, keep in mind, in a pastured setting, you have animals depositing manure, and maybe you're also mechanically applying some manure that you're taking from other places. That manure that's getting on those pastures by the animals, that needs to be counted when you're thinking about the total nitrogen to apply. So if this legume grass here, if you were shooting for 205 for your maximum N application, if you felt that your animals, you calculated that they were depositing themselves 100 pounds of N, that means you only have about 100 pounds of N that you could apply as milk. So keep that in mind. You have to be thinking about all of the nutrients going on. And some final considerations here. With forages, if your soil test K level is excessively high, adding additional K in the form of milk or manure could increase luxury consumption of K, and that might lead to some trouble. So you might want to monitor forage K levels, especially if you plan to feed to dry cows or springing heifers. Milk sugars in the soil are going to promote growth of, I can't talk. They're going to promote growth of fungi. So these are natural soil decomposers here, and that's normal. So you might see white mats of mycelium on the soil surface. That's normal. And these saprophytes are beneficial. So don't be thinking you need to apply a fungicide. If you have some concerns, talk to somebody, try to ID the fungus that's out there and determine whether it's a beneficial or not. And nutrients from all sources, again, should not exceed crop nutrient need or the acceptable N removal for legumes. Cannot emphasize that enough. And keeping it on the field, not letting it run off. Now, also, one final parting note is where milk is applied, consider soil sampling fields before the next growing season, just to get a sense of where your P and K levels are. Are they where you expect them to be, or have they increased a lot, etc. It will help guide 2021 a little bit better. And that's all I have for now, and we'll be taking questions when we move on to, when we're done with the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. So our next speaker is Mr. Aaron O'Rourke. He's a nutrient management program coordinator with the Wisconsin DNR. And Mr. O'Rourke will be discussing applicable DATCP and DNR rules and regulations for land spreading of milk. Aaron?
Yep, thanks, Jamie. So I'm going to be going over here some of the Wisconsin DNR and the Department of Ag, Trade and Consumer Protection recommendations on land applying milk, and then also the applicable rules and regulations for that land spreading of milk. So early last week, there was a fact sheet that was released, a joint fact sheet between DNR and DATCP. This fact sheet goes over in a more general way a lot of the things that Carrie just talked about, and then also some of the things that I'm going to be talking about here. It was sent out, I think UW Extension sent it out to their contact list. The DNR sent it out to our CAFO contact list, and it also will be attached with the information packet that Jamie's going to be putting together. So to start out, I broke this down between non-permitted and permitted farms. It's a little bit different, especially with who you would want to contact if you need assistance. So first, let's start out with the non-permitted farms. The recommendations from DNR and DATCP is first, if you can swing it, if you have enough manure storage, is to land apply this waste milk in your manure storage, and then apply that via your nutrient management plan if you have one at a later time. This is going to be the easiest and fastest way to dispose of this. It may buy you some time to figure out where and how you want to land apply this. So you do not need the department approval to dispose your milk in your manure storage. So you can go ahead and do that, but it is recommended that you reach out to DATCP staff or county staff or DNR staff just to get more information if you need that. So if you don't have adequate storage to dump that milk there, you can, it is recommended that you land apply that according to an NMP. Again, you do not need department approval to apply this via your nutrient management plan. And as Carrie talked about, you can use book values, which she included in her presentation when applying this. So if you're a non-permitted farm and you need assistance with your nutrient management plan, whether that's changing something or trying to figure out where to go with those land applications, DATCP staff will assist you free of charge. And your best two contacts for that is Sue Porter. I have her number there, and also Ryan Erisman. His number is there as well. If they cannot help you or they don't have the resources to help you, they are going to commit to finding someone who actually can help. Next slide, please. All right, so on that same topic of non-permitted farms, on March 27th, the governor issued an emergency order number 17. What this emergency order did was allow DNR to grant a suspension of the requirement of having a nutrient management plan under NR 151.073. So if If you do not have the ability to apply land or apply the milk to land via nutrient management plan, and you don't have the ability to empty that additional milk into your storage, the DNR can grant a waiver and help you with the land application of that. The land application, even with that suspension of 151, that land application may not cause any kind of discharge of pollutants to waters of the state. So even though we are suspending the requirement to have an NMP, it does not mean that you should be, emptying this into a ditch or letting it run across an impervious surface, things like that. So our ultimate goal with this is to work with those farms to make sure that correct land application activities are taking place, like uniform application, correct rates and application methods, finding the most appropriate land for that application, and then giving suggestions on monitoring weather during this. If you need to get this suspension granted through DNR, it's important to contact your DNR non-point source coordinator. They can help you through that. And those contact numbers and emails are available on the DNR website. Next slide. So now moving on to permitted farms, or the CAFO farms in the state. The first recommendation, again, the easiest, most convenient way is if you have room in your manure structure to dump that milk into those lagoons and then apply it at a later date according to your nutrient management plan that's required via your permit. Again, you don't need the department approval to dump this in your manure storage, as long as you're going to be applying it according to your nutrient management plan. So if you don't have room in your storage, which is the case for a lot of farms, can a land apply this milk? You're going to land apply it via a nutrient management plan. Again, you don't need department approval. Milk for CAFOs is considered a processed wastewater, and so your NR 243 nutrient management plan covers processed wastewater. So you're going to land apply this milk just as you would any kind of processed wastewater in your already established nutrient management plan. One thing that is different for CAFOs is you can use book values for the nutrient content of this milk. Typically, it's required that you test all of your manure and processed wastewater via your permit conditions. However, you can use the book values for milk. If you dump the milk into your storage lagoon, you do still have to follow your permit and sample that as it comes out while you're land applying it at a later date. All right, next slide. Another thing for CAFOs is the emergency order gave us the allowance to reduce the public notice period for any kind of substantial change to your nutrient management plan. So if you're adding land or you're making other changes to the NMP for the purposes of this land application of milk, you have to submit a substantial revision like you typically would do. However, on a case-by-case basis, we can reduce the public notice period from the 14-day requirement anywhere down to a 1-day public notice requirement. We still may take a few days for the processing of the substantial revision. We have to put it through an intake system and get those out for review and approval. However, what we were talking about there is the public notice period. Again, these reductions in public notice are only for the purposes of land application of this milk. If you have any questions about this, or you kind of need to know how to proceed forwards, reach out to your regional CAFO specialists. They can inform you and then inform the staff that does the substantial revisions that this may be coming through. Next slide. So contacts. The best people to get in contact with at the DNR is Chris Clayton. He's the agricultural runoff supervisor. Myself, I can help you with nutrient management questions, especially related to CAFO nutrient management plans. Mike Gilbertson is our statewide non-point or non-permitted farms contact. And then DATCAP, like I said, Sue Porter and Ryan can help you with NMPs, and Lacey is also a contact for that. Next slide. So lastly, I just wanted to go over kind of the approach that the DNR is taking to responding to emergencies, things like spills or runoff events. So our biggest thing is we're trying to limit the contact we have with people during this epidemic. So for emergencies, you're still going to take the same actions. You want to contact the DNR immediately, especially if there's an imminent threat to human health or the environment. Make sure that you're still using the spills hotline, which the number is listed there, and get in contact with your DNR staff. For non-emergencies, the best point of contact right now is DNR via email. Many of the DNR people that are working have work cell phones, which you can find on our website, that contact information. However, email is probably the best point of contact right now for non-emergencies. If you can't get in contact via phone or email, then you can submit a request on the DNR's online form there. For the CAFO program, and this also does move over to non-point, but we are responding to spills and runoff events like normal. We are prioritizing the spills that have a threat to human health and environment, and responding to those first. And when we do respond to those spills, we are making it a #1 priority to limit contact with people. So using cell phone communication, texting, and otherwise adhering to social distancing requirements when responding. So our #1 goal when responding to these, if we do have to go in the field, is safety, and making sure that our staff and also the people that our staff are working with, like farm employees and other agencies, are working in safe conditions. That is all I have. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Aaron. So our last presenter today is Dr. Becky Larson, Extension Specialist and Associate Professor in the Department of Biological Systems Engineering. Dr. Larson will be discussing managing milk and manure storage, handling, and treatment systems.
All right, good morning. I'll try to do this quickly. I just have a few slides for you before we can go into questions. So for manure systems, there's a few things that I wanted to mention. The first one being, do not put any milk into your septic tanks, right? You don't want milk going into your septic tanks, has a lot of fat. In your drain field, there's really small pores and it will clog that entire system. So avoid any milk going into any septic systems. If you want to add the milk waste into your manure storage, I would recommend you go directly to the manure storage, not going through all the other systems in your chain of manure collection and transfer system. So pumping directly to the manure storage. One of the issues there is, again, that fat is going to coat mechanical systems. So if you have a separator or any other systems, any small pores, anything the fat can cling to, it's going to. So if you're going to put it through any other parts of your manure system, be prepared that there could be some clogging issues, there's going to be some odor issues, and then eventually you're probably going to need to do some kind of clean out of those systems once you're done putting milk through them. If you're going to add it to your manure storage, add it to the very last step, right? So again, skipping any processing systems if you can. And then remember that if there's a lot of good information that they already put out there, but remember each of your systems is different. So when you're thinking about where you want to add the milk into your system, my suggestion would be the farthest down the manure system chain as you can to avoid certain components getting milk into it. When you add it to the manure system, it's going to add odors. There's not really any way around that. Some people had asked about adding additives to reduce the odors, but generally additives are made to increase decomposition. Some of them I don't really think do anything, but so increasing decomposition is just going to increase the odors that are made. So there's not really a lot of additives you can do to control odors. You just need to use your normal odor practices, thinking about where you're going to apply, how you're going to apply to limit exposure of people to the odors within there. And you really need to think about, so they put a lot of strategies out there. Do you want to go directly to your manure storage? Do you want to go directly to the land? Do I want to put some milk in a tanker and then dilute it with some manure? Remembering that if you go to your manure storage, it's going to remain in there for the duration. And so you're going to have a lot of odors at the manure storage source. If you don't dilute it and you go directly to the field, you're going to have a lot of production of odor in that field area. So you need to think about, do I have fields really far away from people? Is my manure storage near people, right? So work out a system where you can add the milk that limits the impact to your neighbors and those around you in terms of odor. If we could go to the next slide. Oh, when you add to your manure storage, wherever you might add it, I would mix it very evenly if you decide to do that. But one of the things I want to warn is, like Carrie mentioned before, milk has a really high BOD, so it has a lot of easily degradable materials that are known to increase gas production, right? So we're going to get more gases produced. Generally, the concentrations, they may be a little more, they may be similar than what you have in your manure systems. I think Carrie had mentioned earlier that there's a little more nitrogen if you have low solids content manure, but you know your manure, right? You should have been running tests along this time, so you can see the book values for milk. If the book values for milk are similar to what you've been testing, the concentrations probably won't be totally different if you're adding it in, it's similar. So if I have similar nitrogen content to what I'm adding to the milk, the concentrations in the gases produced will probably be similar. If I have a lot more nitrogen, I'm probably going to increase my ammonia production. For sulfur, if I have similar sulfur numbers, which book values show pretty similar to manure, if you're talking in the range of maybe like, a little higher solids content than Carrie was talking, but we're still in that range. So any liquid or slurry manures should have similar sulfur content to that of milk. So if you're adding milk, it's not going to change that drastically. The reason I mention sulfur is that's what leads to hydrogen sulfide production. The more sulfur I have, the more hydrogen sulfide production I'm going to have. That is the concern, my major concern of gas production for human health, right? If you have really high hydrogen sulfide content, that can be very dangerous. So at this point, the gas production may be increased, the concentration of sulfur is similar, so you'll probably see at least some small increases of hydrogen sulfide production. I can't tell you if the risk is going to be greater or not. The risk is going to increase the more sulfur you have and the higher the temperature gets. So as this, if this moves longer into the height of summer and you're adding milk at those times, the hydrogen sulfide production is probably going to continue to increase as the temperature goes up. So when it comes to manure storage gases, we know they're going to increase, right? How much we don't know, but your risk level, so I can't tell you what your risk level is going to be. So I'm going to recommend that you just use the practices that we always recommend for managing manure gases, right? And so there's a link there. You can go download the fact sheet for free and get the information about how to manage your manure system to limit gases and to protect yourself from those gases. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So when we're talking about processing systems, I think I saw a lot of questions about like a sand separation system. I would avoid any milk going into your sand separation system. The milk components are going to adhere to the sand, which is not something you want in your bedding. So I would put the milk in a place where it's not going to be in the recycle water going into your system. If you have a separate storage where you can mix some manure, great, I would put it there. If you're drawing from your main storage in terms of how that separated liquid is going back through your system, don't put your milk in that system. If you have to, and then it's going to get into the sand lanes or your sand separation system, you're going to need to store your sand for longer if that milk gets in contact with the sand so that it has some time for destruction. In terms of your digester, if you have a digester and you want to add milk to it, I'm going to say that you need to add it very slowly. You need to add it at the reception pit. So mix it as a blend of what's going to go into the digestion system. I would start with a very small amount so that the microbial communities can adjust and that you can assess any impacts to the biogas production and the methane production. Previous research has shown that the biogas is typically going to increase, right? So that's a positive thing. It shouldn't be a huge problem for biogas production, but at a certain point, it's going to lead to severe toxicity. So that's a pretty high concentration. I'll talk about what those are in a second. But so your gas is going to increase, but then sometimes your methane, after you've added a certain amount, will start to go down. That's why I said add it slowly. Look at how your gas production is increasing. Check your methane readings and make sure that as you increase, if you see any little dip, then you know you should stop at that point and maybe even back off the milk a little bit, right? So just be careful as you're adding this. It's also been reported that in some operations, the digester become a little bit more unstable with milk addition. So again, just suggesting very small additions and increasing that content over time. So some previous studies have shown, one study was doing it by volume. So we're talking maybe a 6 to 8% solids in that study of manure. And they were adding milk up to about 19% by volume. And they saw increased gas production up to that point. But after about maybe 5%, the methane production went down a little bit. So overall, I would say up to about 10 or 20%, you're not going to hurt your gas production significantly, but at the lower concentrations, you'll actually get a benefit, whereas at the upper ones, maybe not. But as you're starting to get up into those higher concentrations, again, your system could become more stable, and the decrease in the methane could start to happen at that point. So keep an eye on that as you increase. I also have seen some other ones. If you're using volatile solids and you know that much about how much you're adding to your system, you need to keep the volatile solids under a 50-50 ratio. They show maybe you could add a little bit more than that, but generally I would say keeping pretty low of the volatile solids ratio from the milk and the volatile solids ratio of the manure. There's been some other studies that showed once you start getting really high, once you start adding a lot of milk, it inhibits the microbial communities pretty significantly, and you'll hit a point where you will get zero gas, like you'll reach a toxic level and it'll really hurt your gas production. So you can add to the digester, just be aware of any permitting issues. So make sure how much your permits allow on certain things, and be aware of any implications for your WIN credits if you're receiving any of those. At this point, I would assume it probably wouldn't have a huge impact because it's still on farm, your milk production is still on farm things, but you might want to check with whoever's managing that if it'll change your D3 or D5 or wherever you're at, right? So just make sure that it's not going to impact that. But overall, just try to understand your system. The biggest thing is that you're going to have a lot more odor in these systems. So think about where it is that you're adding it in the system, and try to minimize the milk being added to places where it's going to be near your neighbors. And I think Carrie even mentioned calling your neighbors, letting them know what's happening. I think that's a very wise idea. All right, I think that's all I have, and I'm sure Jamie can move us on to questions.
I can. Thank you very much, Becky. So I'll start with your questions. When putting milk in a storage structure, how will this impact the formation of the natural crust during the warm season?
I imagine, so with the milk on there, I don't think it would affect the fibers floating to the top. I'm not positive, but I don't think it would have a huge issue as you mix them, except that if you're going to agitate it as you add the milk, you're going to destroy the crust, which would lead to more gas losses and of course more odors. So if you're going to try to blend the milk in, you're going to destroy the crust, which would lead to more odors and losses. So just be aware of that. The crust will form over time again, I believe, but if you're going to kind of destroy it as you add the milk, likely.
Thank you. What are the concerns of putting milk into covered manure storages?
So in covered manure storages, the cover would help, obviously, with reducing odors in the storage. But as you add the milk into the cover system, just know, just like a digester, you're going to have increases in gas production. So be aware of that. And in those systems, again, it might drive the CO2 up a little bit. So you might have lower methane production. Also, getting the manure out, you might start to get some coatings from the milk on some of the things that might, require some additional maintenance later if they don't break down all the way.
Thank you. And I'm just reminding all my speakers to unmute themselves. So what about, let me see, daily haul. So how are, for individuals who are on daily haul, how do we recommend they handle their surface liquid manure applications?
I suppose I can answer that. I would say if you have a nutrient management plan and you don't have any type of storage, you have to apply that via your nutrient management plan. And again, reaching out to DATCAP if you're a non-permanent farm, which most likely you are if you're daily hauling. Sue Porter, Ryan Erisman, they can be the ones that'll help you out in deciding where the best places to go are that and the rates that you're going to be applying on those fields.
Carrie or Becky, would you like to add anything?
Not really. I think, following a nutrient management plan is good. And if you don't have one, some of the guidance points that I laid out, don't let it run off. Try to mark, with manure, with daily haul, you can see where you went. With milk, you maybe not be able to see where you went depending on how dry the conditions are. So you might want to try to put flags or something, start, stop points, so you're not double spreading, over a week's time. And
I would just add, think about if you want to add the milk to the manure, do you have enough fields that maybe the odor won't be an issue, or if you want to haul it separately to specific fields that might not have as much concern for odors, or maybe those fields also don't have concerns like they're not near a stream or some other environmentally sensitive area. So you should look at the land base you have available and think about if you want to blend it or if you want to keep it separate. It would also think about, if your manure is a little more solid and you have some concerns of runoff, blending the milk into the solid manure would maybe, help you reduce some of those runoff potential. Whereas if you have fields that you don't have much concern from runoff and you think you'll get good infiltration, maybe keeping it separate would be to your advantage. So take a look at your field site.
Yeah, and there was a clarification comment. So a lot of dairy farmers don't have the equipment to handle liquid materials. Do we have a recommendation of them to how to handle the milk in a safe way?
So if you have a box spreader, I would just add the milk slowly into the solid manure and just watch that it doesn't get too runny that you would start to see it leaking out of the hauling system. Obviously, it's not the ideal way to apply, but if that's your only option, you're just going to have to add it slowly and try to. You could even add some more dry materials in there to make sure that it doesn't get too liquid in the box spreader.
Thank you. Dr. Lebowski, there's a lot of questions about what is the availability of an incorporated versus surface applied milk?
Okay, so that's a great question. So when we talk about fertilizer and even manure, we're always talking about if you surface apply, you could lose some of the nitrogen due to volatilization. And in the manure situation, you can have, depending on the manure, it might be 30 to 70% of the total NM manure could be ammonium. And so that's immediately plant available, and that is the form that will volatilize if it's surface applied. Contrast that to milk. There's that tiny little fraction that's milk, urea, nitrogen, and the rest of it is all protein. So I don't expect that we're going to see volatilization losses with surface application. But there again, we don't really have any data, because the milk is going to soak into the soil and the protein has to get broken down by bacteria, and hopefully the soil will be able to hold on, because when it goes from protein, it'll go to ammonium, and the soil can hold on to that. Another thing that drives ammonia volatilization is high pH. pH is approaching 8, and milk has a pH. I looked it up the other day. It's like, I don't know, 6.6 to 6.8, something like that. So milk itself probably won't be a pH driver of ammonia volatilization. So I don't think we're going to see big differences in availability between surface and incorporated application.
Thank you. There's also questions about SNAP Plus. Are the milk numbers going to be available in SNAP Plus, or are they going to have to put them in manually?
I spoke to Laura Good yesterday. She's the head of SNAP Plus team, and there's a release that's coming out. It should be, I think, this week. She's going to try to get those milk numbers put into SNAP Plus. So the ones that I presented, so they should be there.
Okay. Is there going to be additional guidance, Dr. Lebowski, on the information that you provided today, or an additional document?
Yes, everything that I presented today, we've pulled together a nutrient and pest management program, a 4-page bulletin that should be available later today or tomorrow morning. And the plan right now is that we may be able to send that out or to the email registration list, or we'll send you a link to where you can download it from as a PDF.
Thank you. There are some questions in regards to applying milk to some alternative locations, such as how about landscaping, golf courses, or non-use pastures? Do we have recommendations for those types of uses?
Oh, okay. Well, this is an interesting one. So golf courses, this is probably going to smell. And I'm not, now if the golf course is closed and people can't golf on it, you can maybe put it on there. But, keep in mind a golf course, is going to have good turf and a lot of, good grass there. So that grass, that sod is going to be intercepting a lot of the milk. I mean, it will eventually soak in, but it may hang up on the grass a little bit and produce odor. So you might want to think about that a little bit. Landscaping, again, it's an odor issue. I don't know if we really know anything about vectors as far as, what vector animals you might bring in with that rotting odor. And what was the other one, Jamie?
Non-use pastures.
Oh, non-use pasture. I don't see why you couldn't put it out there. That would be fine. The crop will use it.
I would also think about with the landscaping and the golf course, there's likely to be flies and stuff. So those two may not be the wisest selection if you have other alternatives. Oh,
and on the golf course, a lot of those greens, there's going to be a lot of sand. Don't put it on a green. It would be a fairway, probably not a tee, probably a fairway. We have longer grass.
And Becky, you brought up the topic of flies. We had a question on, is there any way that we can mitigate flies? Either in the pits or land application.
It's a tough one. I think in land application, the incorporating may help to reduce flies. In the pit, it's going to be tough.
Thank you. So just for some clarification, we have a question in regards to, are nutrient management plans suspended during the pandemic?
No, the nutrient management plans aren't suspended. Like I said, if you don't have a nutrient management plan, or you just cannot comply with your nutrient management plan for whatever reason, when trying to land apply this milk, and you also don't have any kind of availability of storage to dump that in, that is when you would contact the DNR, and we could work through a possibility of suspending the requirement for a nutrient management plan or land applying via a nutrient management plan, which comes from that emergency order that the governor selected. So get in touch with your non-point source coordinator if you're a non-point farm. For CAFOs, there shouldn't be any issue as far as needing to suspend it because it is being handled just like a processed wastewater would be in your nutrient management plan. If you are running into issues with where to go with it, or if you have questions about rates and things like that, you can contact myself or your CAFO regional specialist.
Thank you, Aaron. As a follow-up, so for a farmer who does not have manure storage, is having a septic hauler haul extra milk to a municipal storage system an option? Excuse me, a municipal sewage treatment system an option? So can we haul extra milk to municipal storage treatment systems?
I would assume that that's a possibility. I would get in contact with the sewage treatment company though, to make sure that that's a product that they could take. And there is a cost associated with that.
Yeah,
So,
it'll likely be costly, and they'll have their own permitting and requirements.
Now, a small farm too, that doesn't have the ability to apply liquid, if they had a septage hauler, maybe they could they'd be able to hire the septage hauler to haul their milk, and apply it to their fields.
Carrie, has anyone approached the USDA to allow land applications on CRP?
I do not know that.
Let me switch over. I apologize. Switch over. There's many questions on will this link be and presentation and information be provided at a later date? The answer is yes, and we'll talk about some of the links at the end of our session. Aaron, would it be feasible for a dairy farmer to sell their excess fluid milk to a crop farmer so that the farmer could land apply it?
For a permitted farm, you would have to go through our distribution process, which is getting a plan approved through the DNR. So that it could be a possibility. You'd have to contact your CAFO specialist and we have to work through that. That may not be a very fast process, but there is issues with moving a processed wastewater from a permitted farm to a non-permitted farm, especially if that non-permitted farm is going to be land applying it. Now you can, if the other farm has land that you have an agreement with them that you can land spread on, you can add those fields to your nutrient management plan via substantial revision, and then get permission from the department to land apply that milk on those fields. So even though those fields are maybe part of a non-permitted farm nutrient management plan, you can still get that added to your farm's nutrient management plan. As far as a non-permitted farm selling the milk, I do not have the answer for that.
Thank you. Aaron, will the DNR game wardens be issuing citations for milk runoff into streams or drainage ditches, excuse me, and what would this citation look like?
So we are handling a spill or runoff similarly as we were before of this. Typically just running a hose into a drainage ditch and allowing milk to run off into the drainage ditch is not a recommended way to dispose of that. And so we're going to take a look if we have a complaint or if we respond to something like that. We are going to take a look at, was anything done prior to that to try to land apply it or to try to take the steps to store it, put it on land via nutrient management plan. So there is going to be a possibility of enforcement if we find that there's cause for enforcement. So wardens may be responding to events like that, but we are going to use enforcement discretion because we do understand, I guess, the totality of the situation. But my recommendation is just make sure that you're getting in contact with DNR or DACAP to look at the options that you have with land spreading or storing, because we really want to avoid people doing what you just talked about, is just dumping it into a drainage ditch, and that drainage ditch eventually leading to surface water that could lead to pretty substantial contamination.
Well, I would like to thank our speakers for their presentations as well as answering questions as we're butting up against the 12 o'clock hour. So we would like to thank you for your participation in today's webinar. As mentioned before, we'll be posting resources on the listed extension websites that you see on your screen right now in the coming days. As always, please don't hesitate to reach out to the presenters, DATCAP and DNR specialists, and your local UW Extension educators with questions. And with that, we will end the webinar. Thank you again and have a great day.